The stage lights bathed the studio in a golden glow, that familiar warmth that lulled millions of viewers into comfort. Late-night television was meant to feel safe, predictable, a world where laughter was scheduled and discomfort was carefully contained. But beneath the laughter of that night, something darker stirred. The cameras were rolling, the audience clapping on cue, and Jimmy Kimmel walked across the polished floor with the air of a man untouchable. His grin was wide, rehearsed, the smirk of someone who knew he was the king of his domain. Then came Tom Cruise. He stepped into the frame with the practiced poise of a Hollywood veteran, his stride quick, his smile polite, yet his eyes carrying a shadow of restraint. For decades, Cruise had lived in the glare of fame, learning the discipline of masks. But this night, the mask was thinner than usual. The applause swelled as he shook Kimmel's hand and took his seat. It seemed ordinary, another ritual of entertainment. Yet even in that first moment, a tension vibrated between them, invisible to most, like the sharp intake of breath before an argument. Kimmel leaned in with his trademark half-mocking warmth. Tom Cruise, ladies and gentlemen. The man who risks his life more often than most of us risk traffic tickets. The crowd laughed, the band punctuated with a riff. Tom smiled, nodded, played along. But his jaw tightened. He wasn't here to be a punchline. The banter began, light and playful. Kimmel teased about skydives, motorcycle stunts, the impossible stunts that Cruise had made his calling card. The audience chuckled on cue, every laugh a reminder that Cruise's reputation was as much about spectacle as it was about cinema. But then Kimmel pressed further, his voice turning sharp beneath the humor. Tell me, Tom, do you ever worry that one day you'll finally hit the wall? Or maybe, he smirked, you already have. And you just don't know it yet? The room laughed again, but this time the sound wavered. The line was meant as comedy, but its sting was unmistakable. Cruise shifted in his chair, his posture straighter now, his eyes held steady on Kimmel, unblinking. He forced a smile, but the silence after his laugh was heavy. Kimmel, sensing the crack, pressed further. I mean, you've got the stunts, the age-defying energy, the intensity. But come on. Do you ever think people look at you and say, maybe this guy's taking himself a little too seriously? He paused, feigning innocence, then added with a grin, or is that a sensitive topic? This time, the audience didn't laugh as quickly. They felt the shift. Cruise leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on his knees, and the mask slipped. His voice, when it came, was calm, deliberate, and edged with steel. You know, Jimmy, he said softly, I've spent my entire life putting everything I have into my work. Every ounce of focus, every bit of risk. And what I've learned is this: taking yourself seriously isn't a flaw. It's the only reason anything gets done. The crowd hushed, waiting. Kimmel chuckled nervously, trying to break the tension. Well, sure, but you've got to admit, you're a little intense. Cruise's eyes narrowed, his tone stayed even, but the undercurrent carried a warning. Intensity is the difference between talking about doing something and actually doing it. You make a living by laughing at people who give their lives to something. That's your choice. But don't confuse entertainment with truth. The air in the studio thickened. Some in the audience clapped, unsure if they were meant to. Others sat frozen, eyes darting between host and guest. Kimmel leaned back, his smile faltering for the first time. He wasn't in control anymore. The night had begun like countless others, another round of jokes and applause, but within minutes, the balance had shifted. The stage was no longer a playground. It was an arena, and the laughter that once filled it now felt like echoes in a courtroom, where every word was testimony and every silence a verdict waiting to be delivered. The laughter in the room lingered faintly, but it was already changing. Kimmel, perched on the edge of his chair, sensed the shift and leaned into it, determined to steer the energy back to his rhythm. His voice carried that familiar blend of charm and cruelty, a smile sharpened into a blade. You've been doing this for what, 4 decades now? Kimmel asked, his tone playful but pointed. Jumping out of planes, dangling from helicopters, clinging to the sides of buildings. I've got to say, at some point, Tom, most men your age are buying reading glasses, not sprinting across rooftops. The audience chuckled, though the sound was more polite than genuine. Cruise tilted his head, acknowledging the jab with a small smile, but his silence stretched a beat too long. Kimmel filled it quickly. I mean, do you wake up in the morning and wonder if you're... Compensating? Like the rest of us buy a sports car? He gestured broadly toward Cruz. You climb the world's tallest skyscraper. Bit much, don't you think? A few louder laughs scattered through the audience, but the undercurrent was uneasy. Cruz remained still, his eyes fixed on Kimmel as though dissecting every syllable. He had endured jokes before, endured headlines, endured years of mockery dressed as banter, but tonight he wasn't willing to play the clown. Kimmel pressed on, emboldened by habit. Of course, that's you. Always at 110%, whether it's the stunts or, other things. His grin widened as he leaned closer, lowering his voice in mock sigh. Like the church. The crowd gave an awkward ripple of laughter, some gasping faintly. Cruz's jaw tightened. His fingers laced together, knuckles white for a brief moment before he released them. The remark wasn't about movies anymore. It was personal, intimate, the kind of provocation that turned amusement into assault. Kimmel, sensing the discomfort but mistaking it for victory, kept going. Don't get me wrong, Tom. We love you, but you've got to admit, sometimes it feels like you're intense in ways the rest of us can't quite keep up with. The stunts, the smiles, the secrecy. Ever think people just don't buy it? The silence that followed was different. The laughter had evaporated. The studio audience, conditioned to cheer and clap on cue, hesitated. Something about the words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Cruz leaned back in his chair, his smile gone, his gaze unyielding. The pause was no accident. It was measured, deliberate, and suffocating. Finally, Cruz spoke. His voice was even, quiet enough that the room had to lean in to hear. You think you know me, Jimmy? The words carried a weight that stilled the air. Kimmel's grin faltered for a split second before he recovered with a chuckle. Hey, it's all in good fun. Cruz cut him off, his tone sharpening. No, you've been making jokes about me, about my work, about my life for years. And maybe you think that's harmless. Maybe you think because you're behind a desk and I'm in this chair, it's your job to laugh at me. He paused, eyes locked on Kimmel's. But every joke leaves a mark. Every word shapes how people see someone. And I'm not here tonight to let you decide who I am. The audience gasped quietly, a murmur rolling through the rows. Kimmel shifted in his seat, trying to brush it off. Come on, Tom, don't be so serious. This is comedy. Cruz leaned forward again, closing the pace between them. His tone was steady, but his stare was unflinching. Comedy doesn't excuse cruelty. For the first time in years, Kimmel didn't have a comeback. His laugh rang hollow. The band, unsure, stayed silent. The cameras caught everything, the flicker of unease in Kimmel's eyes, the unwavering steadiness of Cruz's gaze. What began as a game of barbs had become something else. The audience could feel it, the shift from performance to confrontation. The man they had come to see entertain was now demanding to be seen, not as a spectacle, but as a human being reclaiming his ground. The balance of power so natural on Kimmel's stage had cracked. The host, accustomed to command, was now exposed under the glare of his own spotlight. The silence in the studio stretched, heavy and unrelenting, until Cruz broke it with a calmness that felt sharper than anger. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried, each word deliberate, each syllable landing like a measured strike. You sit there every night, he said slowly, his eyes never leaving Kimmel, and you make a career out of mocking people, turning their struggles into punchlines, reducing their work, their pain, their lives, into something to laugh at. The crowd hushed. The tension was electric now, a current running through every seat. Kimmel gave a nervous chuckle, trying to puncture the silence. Tom, it's just jokes. People tune in for a laugh, not a lecture. Cruz leaned in, his hands clasped tightly, his gaze unflinching. A laugh at someone else's expense. That's the part you never acknowledge. Do you know what that does, Jimmy? Do you understand the weight of your words when you put someone on trial in front of millions, with no chance for them to defend themselves? He gestured lightly, sweeping a hand toward the cameras, toward the audience watching both in the room and across the country. This isn't a living room conversation. This is broadcast. This is amplified. Every time you call someone ridiculous, every time you drag their name through your monologue, you're branding them, and those brands don't wash off. The audience broke into scattered applause, instinctive, almost uncertain, as if acknowledging a truth they had not expected to hear. Kimmel's smile thinned. He shifted in his chair, his knuckles tapping against his desk as he tried to keep the upper hand. People know it's comedy. Nobody takes it seriously. Cruz's laugh was short, humorless. Don't they? Ask the people who have been laughed at until they broke. Ask the artists who never recovered from being treated like a joke. Words matter, Jimmy. And you wield yours like weapons while pretending it's harmless. Kimmel's tone hardened. I give people something to laugh about in a world that's already too dark. If you can't take a joke, maybe you shouldn't come on shows like this. Cruz straightened, his shoulders squared, his tone firm but unwavering. I can take a joke. What I won't take is hypocrisy. You hide behind the word comedy, but what you're doing is exploitation. And tonight, I'm not playing the role you've written for me. I won't be the fool, the headline, the caricature. His words hung heavy, and the audience, sensing the gravity, erupted this time into loud applause. The energy shifted unmistakably, no longer leaning toward the host, but toward the man daring to defy him on his own stage. Kimmel's grin wavered, his voice quieter, almost defensive now. So, what? You think you're above it all? You think nobody should ever make fun of you? Cruz shook his head. This isn't about me. It's about a culture that profits from humiliation. You take the very things people work hardest for, their craft, their convictions, their humanity, and you turn them into cheap entertainment. You've built an empire on other people's scars, and then you laugh when they bleed. The room was electric. The studio audience, accustomed to easy jokes and applause signs, was now caught in something raw and unscripted. Viewers at home would later describe the air as charged, as though everyone knew they were watching a line being crossed and redrawn in real time. Kimmel swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting with the stack of cards on his desk. For the first time, his composure cracked. He tried a weak smile, but it didn't land. You're really worked up about this, huh? Cruz leaned forward, his voice dropping lower, more intimate, but somehow louder in its resonance. I'm worked up because for years I've kept my head down, laughed along, played the part. But I'm not going to sit here and let you, or anyone else, define me with smirks and sound bites. Not anymore. A silence followed, dense and unmoving, broken only when a wave of applause crashed through the audience like a verdict. The camera cut to Kimmel, his expression taut, his grip on the desk tight. For the first time, he looked less like the judge and more like the defendant, caught in a trial he never expected. The clash had shifted. No longer an interview, no longer a game of banter. It was a confrontation, live and unfiltered, and Tom Cruise had seized the mic, reclaiming not just the moment, but the narrative itself. The applause lingered long after Cruise's words fell silent, a tide that seemed to swell against the host himself. Jimmy Kimmel sat frozen behind his desk, his usual arsenal of smirks and punchlines slipping uselessly from his grasp. For a man who had built an empire on commanding the room, the sudden loss of control was disorienting, even humiliating. He forced a laugh, shaking his head as if to wave off the moment. Okay. Look, folks, this isn't Meet the Press. It's supposed to be fun. Tom's just getting intense, as usual. He turned to the audience with a grin he had hoped would restore the rhythm. You know him, right? Mr. Serious? A few nervous chuckles bubbled from the crowd, but it wasn't the roar he expected. Instead, the laughter sounded hollow, almost apologetic. People weren't laughing with him, they were watching him, and they were watching Cruz even closer. Cruz didn't blink. His posture was steady, shoulders squared, his gaze fixed like a beam of light. He wasn't attacking, he was dismantling. Every pause, every silence, pressed harder than words. Kimmel cleared his throat, his hand fiddling with the stack of blue cards he usually flipped through for scripted questions. He shuffled them, tapped them on the desk, then finally dropped them all together. Come on, Tom. He tried again, voice slightly strained. You've been in this business long enough to know what the game is. You sit here, I crack a few jokes, people laugh, we move on. That's how it works. Cruz leaned forward, voice calm but unwavering. That's how it works for you. But it doesn't end when the cameras cut. You leave, you go home, and the punchline stays attached to the person you mocked. You make a living off that weight, but the people you target, they have to carry it. The audience murmured in agreement, a sound that rattled Kimmel more than Cruz's words. He raised his hands defensively. Hey, don't put me on trial here. I'm not the villain. I tell jokes. That's my job. Cruz's eyes narrowed, his tone sharpening. Your job doesn't absolve you. You know exactly what you're doing when you cross the line. You laugh while others get crushed, and when someone pushes back, you hide behind the word comedy like it's a shield. The tension was palpable now. Kimmel shifted in his seat, tugging at his tie, his usual confidence unraveling under the weight of Cruz's steady glare. He forced another laugh, but this time it broke midway, sounding more like a cough. Well, I guess I should be honored, he muttered. The great Tom Cruise giving me a lecture on morality. That's a new one. Cruz didn't flinch. This isn't a lecture, it's accountability. His words landed like a gavel, sharp and final. You've made yourself the judge of everyone else. But tonight, people get to see you under the same light, and maybe they'll decide if your jokes are really just harmless, or if they're poison dressed up as entertainment. The studio erupted with applause, louder than before, echoing through the rafters. Kimmel's eyes darted toward the audience, searching for support, but the faces staring back weren't laughing. They were scrutinizing, weighing, judging. The irony was impossible to ignore. On his own set, behind his own desk, surrounded by his own audience, Kimmel suddenly felt like a defendant cross-examined before a jury. The cards were gone, the script demolished. Every instinct told him to fight back, to reclaim the stage with wit and swagger, but the timing had shifted irreversibly. Every joke would sound like deflection, every laugh like weakness. He sat back, lips pressed thin, and tried to mask his unease, but the sweat gathering at his temple betrayed him. The cameras, merciless in their clarity, captured every flicker of discomfort. Across from him, Cruz remained calm, collected, unyielding. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The silence between them was its own testimony, a reminder that sometimes the most devastating blows aren't shouted, but delivered in measured, unshakable truth. And as the applause faded into an expectant hush, the balance of the night had been rewritten. The king of late night no longer looked untouchable. He looked cornered. The audience barely had time to process the tension from the last exchange when Jimmy leaned forward, forcing a smile that was equal parts charm and malice. You've had your share of critics, Tom. Some say your career has been built on image more than substance. Care to address that? His tone dried, upped with mockery, daring Tom to stumble. Tom straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening, his fingers pressed together as though holding back a storm. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence itself became its own weapon, filling the studio with a nervous hum. Finally he spoke, his voice low but unyielding. You think what I've done is an image? Try hanging off the side of a plane at 6,000 feet. Try surviving 30 years in this business without compromising who you are. Image doesn't keep you alive, Jimmy. Commitment does. A murmur rippled through the audience, some leaning in with awe, others whispering in disbelief at his defiance. Jimmy, sensing the crowd turning, forced a laugh that rang hollow in the studio. So you're saying critics are wrong? That they don't see what the rest of us see? Tom leaned closer, his eyes unblinking, his voice now sharp enough to cut. I'm saying critics are paid to sit in a chair and judge. I've spent my life out there risking everything to tell stories people believe in. You tell me which is harder. The audience erupted, some clapping, others gasping at the rawness of his retort. For the first time, Jimmy's smile faltered, the tension between them almost tangible. Sounds like you've got something to prove, Jimmy muttered, trying to pull back control, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. Tom's gaze didn't waver. No, Jimmy. I've already proved it. Every time I step on set, every time I put my life on the line for a role, the only one still questioning it is you. The words landed like a hammer, echoing in the charged silence that followed. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, erupted again, louder this time, some even rising to their feet. The dynamic had changed. Tom was no longer the guest on Jimmy's stage. He had become the commanding force, turning the interview into a battlefield he refused to lose. The tension was razor-sharp, every eye in the studio fixed on Tom and Jimmy as the air thickened with anticipation. Jimmy adjusted his tie, the flicker of unease visible for the first time. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was brittle, lacking its usual confidence. "So," Jimmy began, his voice steady but his eyes darting briefly toward the audience, "you really think your stunts, your risks, make you untouchable? That they put you above criticism?" Tom didn't flinch. He leaned in, his gaze unwavering, his voice calm but laced with fire. "It's not about being untouchable, it's about respect. I've given everything, blood, bone, and years I'll never get back, to this craft. And you sit here, reducing it to a punchline." The audience gasped, the weight of Tom's words cutting through the studio like a blade. Jimmy's smile faltered, his grip tightening on the cue cards he no longer dared to glance at. "Tom," Jimmy pressed, his voice hardening as he attempted to regain control, "isn't it true that what you call sacrifice, others might call ego? That maybe, just maybe, you do it all to feed your own legend?" The question hit like a jab, but Tom didn't retreat. Instead, he let the silence linger, his eyes locked on Jimmy with an intensity that silenced even the whispers in the crowd. Then he spoke, each word deliberate, like the strike of a hammer. "My legend? I don't build it. The people who believe in these stories do, the ones who sit in the dark, hoping for something real. I don't risk my life for ego. I risk it because I refuse to cheat them. That's the difference between you and me, Jimmy. You hide behind jokes. I put everything on the line." The crowd roared, applause erupting so loud it drowned out the faint ooze of disbelief. Jimmy's shoulders stiffened, his mask of control slipping further. For the first time, the roles had reversed completely. Tom was no longer the guest answering questions. He was the judge, and Jimmy, the man who prided himself on control, was suddenly on trial. The camera caught Jimmy's forced smile, his eyes betraying the storm brewing inside. He had underestimated his guest. Now the audience knew it. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted so violently it was almost tangible. The laughter that usually filled the air had evaporated, replaced by a tension so thick it pressed against the walls. Jimmy shuffled in his seat, tugging at his sleeve as if trying to hide the crack in his composure. The cameras zoomed in, catching every flicker of doubt in his eyes. Tom leaned back slightly, calm but unyielding, his posture commanding. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence was louder than anything Jimmy could muster. The crowd, now fully on Tom's side, sat in hushed anticipation, waiting to see how far this confrontation would go. Jimmy cleared his throat, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "All right, Tom. So you're the hero, the martyr, the man who bleeds for the silver screen. But tell me this, do you ever think about the people you put at risk? The crew, the stunt teams. Are they part of your sacrifice or just pawns in your obsession with danger?" The audience gasped at the pointedness of the question. A ripple of unease spread, but Tom didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice low, steady, carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Every single one of them matters to me. I train harder than anyone. I prepare longer than anyone because their safety is in my hands. Don't twist it, Jimmy. Don't turn dedication into obsession just because you can't understand it." Jimmy tried to laugh, but the sound rang hollow. "You make it sound noble, Tom, but at the end of the day, it's still about you being the star, the one in the spotlight." Tom's eyes narrowed, his words sharp enough to see, lice through the facade. "And at the end of the day, Jimmy, it's about you hiding behind that desk, tearing others down to get your laugh. Maybe the difference is, without someone else's name in your meh."